7 years ago, Josiah Briggs rode out of Cedar Hollow, leaving behind a debt and a quiet promise. Now he's back, dust-covered eyes steady, holding a loan note from a widow who once saved his life. But the town's changed. The law bends for men like Mayor Clegg, and the land Josiah came to protect. It's being stolen one forged deed at a time. He doesn't raise his voice, doesn't seek revenge, just stamps that old note paid in full, and starts to rebuild one fence post, one act of grace at a time. Will truth be enough? When power turns its back, a framed deed above the hearth becomes his answer. The wagon wheels cut shallow ruts through the thawing dirt road as Josiah Briggs reined in his mule just outside the town line. Cedar Hollow hadn't changed much in 7 years, same clapboard buildings weathered gray by wind, same sagging saloon shutters, same church steeple rising like a stubborn promise. But Josiah had changed. His shoulders bore the weight of long trails and silent winters. The brim of his hat drooped more than it used to, and the revolver at his hip hadn't been touched in months. He didn't come back to stir dust, just to settle a debt. He reached into his coat and pulled out the folded paper, a loan note signed by Frank Carver back in '74. Josiah had traded him a fine young colt saddle broke in exchange for $60 and the understanding it'd be squared in a year. The colt had died of colic within weeks. Frank never paid. Josiah had left it be. But then came Sarah's letter, written with careful ink and fraying edges. Please understand, Mr. Briggs, my husband passed last spring. I remember your horse. He always said he owed you. I don't have the money, not now with the girls growing and the land taxes what they are, but I will find a way. Josiah had read that letter under a cottonwood tree in Arizona, heart pinched by memory. Frank had once dragged him from a swollen creek when a green bronco bucked him clean into the rapids. The man had his faults, but he had saved Josiah's life. That counted for something. So now Josiah stood on Main Street again, boots caked with trail dust, loan note in hand. He walked to the post office, asked after the Carver homestead. The clerk squinted at him. Up Jefferson Fork Way. She's holding it best she can. He tipped his hat. Appreciate it. Outside, folks slowed their steps to stare. A few whispered. One boy called, "That the man Pa said ran off." Josiah said nothing. Sheriff Markham stepped out of the barber shop, arms crossed, mustache twitching. Didn't reckon Cedar Hollow would see you again, Briggs. Didn't reckon it'd matter, Josiah answered evenly. The sheriff took a step closer. Town didn't ask for your return. Josiah met his gaze. Didn't come for the town. He turned and left Markham standing in his boots. The road out to the Carver place was rougher than he remembered. A fence leaned into the wind like it had given up trying to stand straight. Chickens scratched at dry patches of yard. The barn door hung crooked. Sarah met him on the porch. Her dress was patched, and her eyes rimmed with the weariness of too many days without enough sleep. A young girl peeked from behind her skirt, thumb in her mouth. "Mr. Briggs," Sarah said softly, as if unsure he was real. He handed her the folded note. "This belongs to you." She took it puzzled and unfolded it slowly. Her face paled. I meant to write again. I haven't." Josiah pulled a stamp from his coat pocket, pressed it to the bottom of the page. Paid in full. He didn't wait for thanks. "You got coffee?" he asked. Sarah blinked, then nodded, voice shaky. "Yes, sir. Come inside." Inside the cabin smelled of hearth smoke and flour. Two girls shared a stool at the table, drawing on scrap paper. Josiah nodded to them as he hung his hat. "I can fix that fence tomorrow," he said. "If you've got a spare hammer." "You don't have to," she began. "I know." That night, as the girls slept and the fire burned low, Sarah sat across from him. She studied his worn face, the hands that curled around a chipped cup of chicory brew. "Why'd you come back?" she asked. Josiah looked into the flames. "Because walking away once was easy," he said, voice steady. "I'm done being easy." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the sound of distant church bells and the faint creak of a crooked sign swaying above Main Street. But Josiah Briggs didn't hear it. He was already planning where to place the first new fence post. The next morning, Josiah laced up his boots and set a kettle over the fire. Sarah had already gone to milk the goat, leaving a quiet hush in the cabin. Her daughters were still asleep, tangled in a wool blanket on the floor beside the hearth. Josiah took a moment to glance at them, small hands curled, cheeks smudged with charcoal from the stovepipe they'd helped clean yesterday. He let the moment settle. Then he folded up the list Sarah had left for him: nails, salt, flour, oilcloth for the leaky window. With the note tucked into his vest and Sarah's youngest Daniel, barely 6, trotting beside him. In socked feet, Josiah stepped into the morning sun. They walked into town slow, the way you do when you don't want to draw attention but can't help it anyway. Cedar Hollow had never taken kindly to folks who came back different, and Josiah, no matter how quiet he walked, carried years of dust and silence like a second coat. At the cobbler's, Daniel's worn boot had split along the side. Josiah lifted the boy onto the porch and knocked gently. The door didn't open. He knocked again. Nothing. Then came the click of the lock sliding shut. Josiah stepped back, lips tight. "Guess we'll try the general store," he said, lifting Daniel down. The store bell jingled as they stepped in, drawing every eye inside. A woman at the counter stepped aside without a word. The owner, Mr. Gibbons, a thick-necked man with thin eyes, glanced up from his ledger. "Well," he said, "didn't know we was open to charity." "Didn't ask for charity," Josiah said calmly. "Just nails, flour, and some oilcloth." Gibbons scratched his chin. "Nothing here for you, not anymore." Daniel looked up confused, but Mama said. Josiah gently touched the boy's shoulder. "Come on." Outside, the wind had picked up. It tugged at Josiah's coat as he led Daniel toward the hardware shed beside the smithy. But before they made it halfway across Main Street, a familiar voice cut through the cold air. Briggs barked, "Sheriff Markham." Josiah turned slow. The sheriff approached with 2 deputies, hand resting too casually on his belt. "What's the charge?" Josiah asked before the man could speak. Markham grinned. "Loitering, public disturbance, suspicion of vagrancy. I was buying supplies. Doesn't look like it." Josiah straightened. "I'm not here for trouble, Sheriff. Just a list. For Sarah." Markham's grin faded slightly at the name. "You think hiding behind her skirts makes you welcome?" Daniel stepped closer to Josiah, hand gripping his pant leg. Before Josiah could speak, a voice called out from across the street. "She's within her rights," said Sarah, striding fast from the far side of the post office. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes bright with something stronger than fear. She pulled a folded page from her satchel and held it out. Homestead Act of 62. Clause 3 states that legal wage earners assisting with agricultural work are entitled to reside and operate within township limits so long as their services are rendered on settled land. Markham didn't take the paper, just stared at her. Josiah blinked, slightly surprised. Sarah stepped closer, voice steady. "You want to challenge that sheriff? Take it up with Helena." A long pause. Then Markham backed up, motioning lazily to his deputies. "No harm done," he muttered, "just keeping peace." They turned and walked off, boots crunching on dry dirt. Josiah let out a slow breath. Sarah glanced at him. "You okay? I've had worse welcomes." They walked side by side in silence for a while, the sun just starting to warm the ground. Later that night, back at the cabin, Josiah sat by lamplight mending Daniel's boot with an old awl and waxed thread. The leather was cracked, but it'd hold a while longer. Sarah stood in the doorway, arms folded loosely. "You didn't have to stay after that," she said quietly. Josiah didn't look up, wasn't planning to leave. "Why?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. He tied off the thread and set the boot down gently, then met her eyes. "Because walking away once was easy," he said again. "And I'm done being easy." She didn't speak. But when she turned away, Josiah thought just maybe her shoulders sat a little straighter than they had the night before. Rain rolled in from the north that week, steady and cold, turning the yard around Sarah's cabin into a slick stretch of churned mud. Josiah spent 2 days straight hammering fresh slats onto the fence line, with Daniel trailing behind him, collecting bent nails like treasures. When the rain finally broke, he climbed up to the barn loft looking for a dry tarp. Instead, he found a crate of old feed bags, sun-bleached bridles, and tucked behind a loose plank. Something better, a rolled paper tied with blue ribbon. Josiah slid it free and unrolled it slowly. The ink had faded, but not so much that he couldn't read the words. Grant of title, 11 acres along Jefferson Fork, transferred from Amos Ridley to Miss Sarah Ridley Carver, 1874. It was real, signed and notarized, clear as any daylight. Josiah climbed down the ladder 2 rungs at a time, boots landing solid on the ground. Inside, Sarah was folding laundry by the stove, humming a tune too faint to name. "Found something," he said, laying the paper on the table between them. She stared, then leaned in, eyes scanning the page. Her hands trembled as she touched the edge. "My father gave it to me when Frank and I wed," she whispered. But I thought it burned in the chimney fire years ago. Josiah folded the deed gently. Might be time we made a copy. The county office sat squat behind the schoolhouse with dust-caked windows and a front stoop 2 inches off level. Inside, Clerk Walden, a narrow-shouldered man with thin spectacles and a sharper tongue, looked up from his desk, like someone had tracked manure across his ledger. "You've got," what he asked flatly. "Original deed to the Carver property," Josiah said, laying the paper down. Walden adjusted his glasses. "Doesn't change what's on file." "What is on file?" Josiah asked calmly. Walden pulled out a bound registry and flipped a few pages. "Deed transferred last month. Owner of record is now Mayor Clegg." Sarah stepped forward. "That's not possible. This is my land." Walden shrugged, indifferent. "New deed signed, sealed, and notarized?" Josiah studied the page. The new deed was dated February 10th. The original clearly visible dated November 2nd, 1874. "The ink on this one isn't even dry," Josiah said. "It's legal," Walden said, closing the book. "Unless you file a dispute." Josiah pulled a pen from behind the clerk's counter, dipped it in ink, and wrote cleanly across the official ledger, "Disputed claim, based on prior deed dated 1874. Walden frowned. "Won't matter. Maybe not to you," Josiah said, "but it will to someone." Back at the cabin, Sarah sat at the table, turning the deed over in her hands, like it was something fragile that might vanish if she blinked. The girls played nearby, dragging ribbons through a bucket of rainwater like it was a fine game. Josiah poured 2 mugs of weak coffee and handed her one. "You really think this'll hold?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "If their lies are in ink, so's our truth, and ours is older." She looked at him, then really looked. Not just the dust on his sleeves or the calluses on his hands, but the steadiness behind his eyes. The way he made room for her without demanding space in return. "I thought I'd have to fight this alone," she whispered. "You're not alone," he said. That night, Josiah laid the copy of the deed on the mantel beside the oil lamp. He sat by the hearth long after everyone else had gone to sleep, fingers tracing the grooves in the wood, mind turning. Mayor Clegg hadn't just bought a false deed. He was planning something quiet, paper-bound, and dangerous. Josiah folded the original deed once more, slipped it into a canvas pouch, and tucked it inside his coat. Because in Cedar Hollow, truth didn't shout, but it sure as hell could leave a mark. Spring came early that year, with wildflowers blooming along the creek beds and cottonwoods whispering in the breeze. Cedar Hollow stirred to life like a bear waking from hibernation, hungry for gossip and spectacle. The annual Jubilee was the town's way of shedding winter pie contests, fiddle reels, horse races, and enough banners to make even the sullen smile at least for a while. Josiah didn't plan on going, but Sarah handed him a tin pie dish that morning wrapped in a clean tea towel. "You made this?" he asked, eyeing the crust. "No," she said. "You did. Last week. Remember, when you said the leftover apples were going soft?" He did. Quiet evening. Girls asleep. He'd stirred cinnamon like he was building a saddle tree, careful and slow. "Enter it," she said, folding her arms. "Town needs to see the man I see." Josiah met her gaze. "I'm not here for ribbons. You're here for respect," she replied. "Sometimes you have to claim it out loud." Main Street was bustling by noon, canopies flapping and fiddles wailing between laughter and the clatter of boots on hard pan. Josiah walked with the pie tucked in a cloth, Sarah beside him, her hair braided and pinned. The girls skipped ahead, sticky with honey drops. They dropped off the pie at the long judging table, wedged between peach tarts and blackberry crumbles from women who hadn't said more than 2 words to Sarah since Frank's funeral. Josiah set the tin down without ceremony. Mayor Clegg took the bandstand just as the judging started. Dressed in a white waistcoat and gold chain watch, he held a lemonade in one hand and a microphone in the other, or might as well have. "Folks," he boomed, "ain't it fine to see Cedar Hollow thriving again? After hard winters and short tempers, we've come back to what matters, community tradition and the kind of moral fiber that doesn't wear thin with weather." A few chuckles rippled. Clegg's eyes landed on Josiah. Course, he continued, "Some folks think pie and pity are enough to earn trust again. Some folks trade dirt and decency for ribbon crusts and sympathy." The crowd laughed, louder this time. Josiah didn't flinch, just crossed his arms. Sarah's jaw tightened. "He's baiting you." "I know," Josiah said, "and I'm not biting." The judging ended with little fanfare. Mrs. Murdoch's rhubarb won first as always. Josiah's apple didn't place, no mention. No taste test even. But later, behind the church tent, Miss Lillian, the widowed baker with flour always on her sleeve, slipped him a folded ribbon and a whisper. They never even touched it. Said your name and moved on. But I tasted it, and it was the best one on that table. Josiah took the ribbon without a word, just nodded once, brim low. Lillian touched his sleeve gently. You earned it. He walked home alone. Sarah had stayed to help with clean up the girls chasing fireflies behind the booth stalls. The wind had picked up cold and sharp, carrying the echo of Clegg's voice. At the cabin, Josiah placed the ribbon inside the drawer with the deed copies, not out of pride, but principle. He sat by the fire and stared into the embers until the door opened and Sarah stepped inside. Her shawl was dusted with pollen, her face tired. You okay? She asked. I'm used to losing, he said. Well, she said gently, I'm not used to you being here. He looked up, brow raised. I mean staying, she added, voice quieter. Even when it's ugly. Josiah gave a half smile, one corner of his mouth twitching. I've got reason now, she nodded. Then hold to it. Outside, laughter still echoed faint from the hills, but inside something else settled. Not celebration, not defeat. Conviction. The road to the county seat stretched ahead like a ribbon of dust and stone, curling through pine forests and wide-open meadows. Josiah rode beside Miss Lillian, the widow baker, their horses' hooves kicking up soft clouds beneath a high, clear Montana sky. The ride was quiet, both wrapped in their own thoughts as the miles passed under creaking saddles. Josiah glanced at Lillian, who kept her gaze fixed on the horizon. Thank you for coming with me, he said, voice low. She shrugged. Someone's got to keep the truth company, and you're a long way from home. He nodded, thinking of Sarah and the girls waiting back at the cabin. Their future, still uncertain, rested on what happened at the courthouse. No one else in Cedar Hollow had shown the backbone to fight Mayor Clegg's lies. Lillian was the first. They reached the county building just as the sun cast its last golden rays. The office was a squat brick building, smelling faintly of oil and old paper. Inside, Clerk Jenner sat behind a cluttered desk, spectacles perched on the tip of his nose. Josiah laid out the deed Sarah had found, worn, authentic, unmistakable. Jenner squinted. This is an original grant, signed, notarized, from Ridley to Carver. Josiah watched him carefully. And the deed filed last month. Jenner's face tightened. Under Mayor Clegg's name. New deed, new claim. Lillian stepped forward. We believe that deed was forged. Jenner frowned. Those are serious accusations. Josiah met the clerk's eyes. We need a certified copy of the original sent to the territorial judge in Helena. If the law's on our side, it has to be heard. Jenner nodded slowly, pulling a stamp and a pen. I'll see to it. The ride back was somber. Clouds gathered low, heavy with threat. As they crested a hill overlooking Cedar Hollow, Josiah spotted a thin plume of smoke curling skyward from the far side of the valley. His heart tightened. They rode faster. Near the cabin, the fence that Josiah and Sarah had worked so hard to mend lay splintered. A smoldering rag, blackened and wet, clung to the broken posts. Sarah's son Daniel knelt among the debris, eyes wide with shock. Josiah dismounted swiftly. What happened? Sarah appeared behind him, face pale but steady. I heard the crash. Thought it was a fallen branch at first. Josiah crouched, dousing the last sparks with his boot. They want us to quit, to be scared. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. We're not. Josiah glanced toward the horizon where shadows lengthened. If we build this with care, he said, they'll have to burn it again, and again. And one day, they'll quit. That evening the cabin was quiet, but for the crackle of the fire and the steady breathing of two girls asleep upstairs. Josiah sat on the porch, repairing a broken hammer handle while Sarah shelled peas beside him. The smell of pine and damp earth drifted on the breeze. Sarah looked up, voice low. How do you keep going? Josiah didn't pause his work, because giving up would be like letting that fire win. She nodded, eyes softening. Frank would have been proud. Josiah stopped and met her gaze. We're building more than fences. We're building a future. The night deepened, full of unseen dangers and quiet promises. Josiah folded his hands in his lap and looked out into the dark, knowing the battle was just beginning, but so was their hope. The dawn broke cold and gray over Cedar Hollow. Josiah sat on the porch steps, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, eyes tracing the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. The calm was a fragile thing, one he knew wouldn't last. By mid-morning, the heavy boots of the sheriff's deputies echoed down the dirt road. Josiah looked up, shoulders squared. Two deputies flanked Sheriff Markham, his face set in a hard line, eyes flickering with something sharper than disappointment. Josiah Briggs, Markham called out, voice carrying over the still air. "You're under arrest." Josiah didn't flinch. For what forgery? Presenting false documents to the county. A knot tightened in Josiah's gut, but he kept his face steady. "Those deeds are real," Markham's jaw tightened. "That's for the courts to decide. You're coming with us." Before Josiah could say more, a rough hand gripped his arm. The grip was hard enough to sting, and Josiah's lips split against his teeth. He winced, but didn't resist. Sarah rushed to his side, eyes wide and fierce. "This isn't right. You can't do this." Markham ignored her. "Step aside, ma'am. This is official business." Lillian appeared, then her face pale but resolute. "You don't want to do this, Markham. Josiah's papers are legitimate. We've got affidavits coming from Helena to prove it." Markham sneered. "Words won't stop the law." Josiah moved quickly, slipping a folded paper into Lillian's hand as they pushed him toward the wagon. "Take this to Jenner," he said. "Tell him to hurry. Judge Fenton will back us up." Lillian nodded, clutching the paper tightly. The deputies shackled Josiah's wrists, cold iron biting into his skin. He swallowed hard, glancing back at Sarah and the girls peering from behind the cabin door. "Hold fast," he whispered. Night fell with a heavy silence broken only by the flicker of oil lamps in the sheriff's office. Josiah sat on a hard wooden bench, wrists raw from the chains. Markham paced, muttering threats beneath his breath, the weight of power pressing down. The room's door burst open. Lillian stood there breathless and dirt-smudged, clutching a telegram and a thick affidavit. "From Helena," she said, voice steady despite the weariness. "Judge Fenton confirms the original deed's authenticity. The new claim by Clegg is fraudulent." Markham's face, paled eyes darting nervously between the papers and Josiah. Lillian laid the documents on the desk with deliberate care. "This changes everything." Josiah met her gaze, a flicker of hope breaking through exhaustion. "Thank you." Back at the cabin, Sarah sat by the fire, clutching the worn deed. The children slept, but her hands trembled. The weight of the fight pressed on her fear, uncertainty, but also a quiet resolve. Josiah's voice broke the silence over the crackling flames. "They think they can scare us into silence." Sarah looked up, eyes bright. "They don't know who they're dealing with." He nodded, drawing her close. "We're not just fighting for land. We're fighting for what's right." Outside, the wind carried the scent of sage and earth, a promise that the battle was far from over, but Josiah Briggs was ready. The morning sun broke through a heavy gray sky as Cedar Hollow's courthouse steps filled with a gathering crowd, more curious than supportive, more wary than welcoming. The air was thick with whispers and unsettled glances. Josiah stood beside Sarah, his arm still bandaged from a scuffle. Days before the pain, a dull reminder of the stakes at hand. Miss Lillian arrived early, clutching a thick bundle of papers, deeds, affidavits, telegrams, proof from Helena Judge Fenton herself. She handed them to the clerk with steady hands, the kind born from baking, more than from the law, but today those papers carried more weight than any judge's gavel. Josiah scanned the faces in the crowd. Some were old friends, nodding with quiet hope. Others were strangers, eyes narrowed in suspicion. And then there was Mayor Clegg standing tall in his polished boots, jaw clenched tight like a man who felt the ground slipping beneath his feet. The hearing began in the open air, the courthouse doors flung wide like a stage set for justice. Judge Garner, a stern man with silver hair and a voice that carried like thunder, stepped forward. "This hearing will address the dispute over the Carver property, a matter brought forth by Mr. Josiah Briggs on behalf of Mrs. Sarah Carver." Josiah met Sarah's eyes. "We'll do this right." Lillian stepped forward first, presenting the certified deed and affidavit from Helena. "This original grant is the rightful claim to the property in question," she declared. "Any subsequent deed, including the one filed by Mayor Clegg, is based on forged documents." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Clegg's face reddened, but he maintained his stance. Next came Tom Fitch, a weathered rancher with decades in Cedar Hollow, etched deep in his lines. He cleared his throat and raised a hand. "I've seen the mayor, offered me coin to turn a blind eye, said it'd be easier if I forgot where the markers on the ridge ran." Josiah nodded, feeling the tide shift. The crowd leaned in. Judge Garner's eyes narrowed. Mr. Fitch, you're certain. Like I'm sure the sun rises. The judge turned to Mayor Clegg. How do you respond to these accusations? Clegg's voice was tight defensive. I have done nothing wrong. The new deed is lawful. The previous claim is outdated, irrelevant. Sarah stepped forward, voice steady, but carrying the weight of every sleepless night. Our claim is older and true. My family's land was stolen, and now we stand to lose everything. Josiah gripped her hand briefly, drawing strength from her resolve. Judge Garner raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. Enough! This court rules in favor of Mrs. Carver. The deed filed under Mayor Clegg is void. A wave of gasps and cheers rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Markham stepped forward, his face pale and tight. Josiah watched as Markham escorted Clegg away, the man's usual swagger replaced with a heavy gait, the weight of consequences finally settling. Sarah's eyes welled with tears. She looked at Josiah, whispering, "Thank you." Josiah squeezed her hand. "We did this together." The crowd began to disperse, some clapping, some shaking their heads, but the air had shifted, justice had spoken, and the truth had found its voice. As Josiah and Sarah walked down the courthouse steps, the afternoon sun broke fully through the clouds, casting long shadows behind them. It was the beginning of something new, fragile, but real. The courtroom victory was just the first step, and Cedar Hollow's dust had barely settled before the real reckoning began. Mayor Clegg's fall was swift, but bruising an indictment for fraud, arson, conspiracy, and tampering with official records was handed down by the territorial court. The news spread through town like wildfire, leaving no one untouched. Sheriff Markham Long caught between loyalty to the powerful and his duty resigned the very next day. The gavel had spoken, and his silence had cost him too much. His departure left a hole in the town's heart, a mixture of relief and uncertainty, hanging heavy in the air. But the community's true healing began not in courtrooms or offices, but in small, honest acts. Neighbors who had once looked away started bringing nails, fence wire, and tools to Sarah's farm. The same hands that had avoided her now worked side by side with Josiah, pounding stakes and tightening boards. Miss Lillian was there with pies, awkward homemade and far from perfect, but they carried the taste of forgiveness. The smell of fresh bread and baking drifted into the evening air, weaving together with the sounds of hammering and quiet laughter. 1 month after the verdict, under the wide, forgiving branches of the cottonwoods, by Jefferson Fork, Reverend Hart stood ready. The crowd was small, but filled with genuine smiles, the kind that don't need words to be understood. Josiah wore his best shirt, simple and clean, with sleeves rolled just right, and Sarah's eyes shone with a quiet joy that made the hard days feel distant. The girls clung to each other nearby, their laughter like the first warm breeze after a long winter. The ceremony was modest, no grand cake, no booming music, just Miss Lillian's pie, a single fiddle playing low notes that caught the breeze and the soft murmur of well-wishers. When Reverend Hart spoke the vows, the children chimed in, calling Josiah Pa, before the words were even fully said. It was the kind of moment that stitches families together in ways no paper deed ever could. Josiah glanced at Sarah, lips curving in a tired but genuine smile. "We're building more than fences now," he whispered. She nodded, eyes misty. "We're building a home." In the days that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. The cabin grew sturdier with new walls patched in cedar and windows tightened against the coming cold. Josiah took to crafting saddles in the old barn, the leather smelling rich and familiar beneath his hands. He taught the boys from town how to mend harnesses and care for their horses, passing on skills that had been nearly lost to fear and hard times. Sarah resumed teaching part-time at the schoolhouse, her presence a steady light for the children, who once watched her struggle and now watched her rise. Rumors of Clegg's arrest faded into whispered lessons about justice and courage. His ledgers, once used to control and threaten, now served as evidence that brought down 3 more conspirators tied to his scheme. Some neighbors who had been distant before now tipped their hats or offered a nod when Josiah passed by. Others remained cautious shadows of old grudges lingering in their eyes. One crisp evening, Josiah stood by the hearth, the old deed framed and hung above the mantel. The paper was yellowed, but unbroken, a testament to truth preserved against the tide of lies. He traced the edge of the frame with a calloused finger and said softly, "Not for pride." Sarah came to stand beside him, warm and steady, "For proof." Josiah nodded, proof that decency still leaves a mark, that sometimes standing your ground can build a future. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the promise of more storms to come. But inside by the firelight, Josiah and Sarah shared a quiet peace, a beginning shaped by grace, resilience, and the steady hands of those who refused to give up. A full year had passed since Josiah Briggs first returned to Cedar Hollow, bearing an old loan note and a quiet promise. The ranch now stood sturdier, its wooden walls weathered but strong, its fences straight and unyielding against the Montana wind. The land that had once been threatened with theft now blossomed under steady hands and unwavering hearts. Josiah sat on the porch, the fading light of dusk warming his weathered face. The sound of laughter floated from the yard, where Sarah's daughters chased fireflies near a freshly built corral. Nearby, Josiah's apprentice, young Tom Bennett, leaned over a half-finished saddle, his fingers learning the delicate art of leatherwork under Josiah's watchful eye. Sarah appeared in the doorway, a soft smile lighting her tired eyes. She carried a tin cup of coffee, the steam curling into the cool evening air. She settled beside Josiah, the familiar warmth settling between them like an old friend. "How's the saddle coming?" she asked. Josiah chuckled, holding up a piece of rough-cut leather. "Not bad for a city boy. Could be worse." She laughed softly. "Just don't teach him to ride like you. I'm still patching my nerves." He gave her a steady look, pride and tenderness mingling in his gaze. "You've done more than patching. You've built a home, not just with wood and nails, but with every choice to stand your ground." Sarah's smile softened, the weight of the past year lifting in that quiet moment. "The town, they're different now. Some still whisper, but fewer every day." Josiah nodded. "Change takes time. But the ledger we found, that's still hanging in the sheriff's office. A reminder." He gestured to a wooden frame above the hearth, visible through the window. Inside was the original deed, the ink faded but unbroken. A symbol not of pride but of proof, a truth that no forged paper could erase. As night settled, Josiah stood and walked to the barn, where the smell of fresh-cut wood mingled with horse sweat and leather dye. He ran his hand along the new fence posts, solid and straight, the work of many hands and many days. He paused at the gate where a new brand was stamped, an eagle with outstretched wings, signaling not just ownership, but resilience. Nearby, Tom approached, wiping dirt from his hands. Sir Tom said, "Do you think the mayor and his men ever thought we'd come back this strong?" Josiah smiled, eyes crinkling. "No, son. They thought fear and lies would hold sway. But we learned something out here on the frontier. Truth is quieter, but it lasts longer." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "And what about you, Josiah? What keeps you going?" Josiah looked toward the cabin where Sarah's lantern glowed softly in the window. "Grace," he said simply. "Grace and the promise that this land and these people deserve better than being pushed down." Inside, Sarah tucked the girls into bed, their whispered prayers filling the room with hope. She paused by the window, eyes tracing the constellations that had guided so many before her. The house was no longer a place of loss, but of beginnings. Josiah joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "We fought for more than land," he said softly. "We fought for dignity, for a chance to be seen." She leaned into him, "And we won." Outside, the wind stirred the tall grass, carrying the scent of rain and sage. The ranch breathed easier as if freed from a long shadow. Josiah stepped back onto the porch, the night sky spread wide and clear above him. He touched the framed deed again, a quiet vow lingering on his lips. "Not for pride," he whispered, "for proof that decency still leaves a mark." The firelight flickered in the window, warm and steady, casting long shadows that danced like memories and promises. In Cedar Hollow, the long fight had ended not with gunfire, but with steady hands, strong hearts, and the enduring power of truth. Ever stood your ground when no one else would? Share your story and subscribe for more frontier tales where truth doesn't shout, but it lasts.